The first season is slowly coming to an end. At the beginning of this season, we talked about the history of home gaming consoles. And in today's episode, let's explore what the future might look like. Virtual reality is a technology that, not too long ago, was expected to become the next big thing in gaming. Many believed it would completely transform the gaming industry. But today, we see that this revolution hasn't fully arrived yet. VR games have certainly carved out their own market, and the technology keeps evolving. New companies enter the market while others leave. The journey of creating and developing virtual reality technology has definitely been interesting. Companies have tried all kinds of experiments, some worked, others didn't, some projects were put on hold until the technology got better, and some of those ideas returned later, improved and ready to try again. In this episode, we will take a closer look at how it all began, how various companies and products competed with each other, and what's happening in VR today. Hi there and welcome to the Released podcast. Today technology surrounds us everywhere, and we can't even imagine our lives without it. But every technology started as a bold idea in someone's head. In this podcast, we talk about the technologies that have changed our lives and the people who invented them. My name is Rival. Hi. Let's start with the history of VR. At first glance, you might think VR is a very new technology, maybe just 10 or 15 years old at most. But in fact, the idea appeared much earlier. The technology available at that time just wasn't advanced enough to achieve everything the inventors dreamed about. Of course, we won't cover every single experiment today, otherwise this episode would become way too long. Instead, let's focus on some of the most interesting moments in this story. As with many technologies, it is actually hard to pinpoint exactly where the story begins. For virtual reality, we could trace it all the way back to 1832, when English physicist and inventor Charles Wheatstone created the stereoscope. Stereoscopes were special devices, kind of similar to modern VR headsets. Typically, a stereoscope had two oculars. When you look through them, each eye saw the same image slightly shifted. This imitates the way our eyes naturally work. And when your brain combines these two slightly different images, it creates a sense of depth, making the picture appear three-dimensional. Wait, hold on. Why are we talking about stereoscope from the 19th century if this episode is supposed to be about modern cutting-edge VR? Well, the truth is that the same principle is still used today. This very principle allowed modern VR devices to create an immersive experience. So, without the stereoscope, there wouldn't be VR as we know it. Just like many other technologies, something similar to VR first appeared in science fiction. Sometimes it seems inventors actually get inspired by such futuristic stories. Back in 1935, an American science fiction author named Stanley Weinbaum published a story called Pygmalion Spectacles. In this story, a professor invents special glasses, capable of simulating not just sight but also sound, taste, smell, and even touch. When the main character puts on these glasses, he is fully immersed in a virtual reality experience. Modern VR headsets today don't yet simulate taste or smell, but apart from that, the idea described by Weinbaum is surprisingly close to what we have nearly 90 years later. The next important stop on our timeline is 1962. That year, an American filmmaker and inventor named Morton Heilig created a device called Sensorama. Morton was fascinated by cinema and wanted to create a truly immersive movie experience. One that engaged not just sight and sound, but other senses too. He wanted to create a movie of the future. By the way, how do you imagine movies of the future? Morton's device ended up looking something like an arcade machine, or one of those photo booths you step into with your friends, make funny faces, and then get a strip of printed photos. With Sensorama, viewers could watch 3D films while also experiencing smells, air movement, and vibrations from their seats. For example, you could immerse yourself in the atmosphere of a motorcycle ride through Brooklyn. You watched a movie, listened to the sounds of the city. The fan simulated the wind. You smelled exhaust fumes and pizzerias, and your seat vibrated to simulate riding a motorcycle. In other words, total immersion. A total of 5 short films were produced for Sensorama. But the invention was expensive, heavy, and perhaps too revolutionary for its time. Investors were not really interested, so it never moved past the prototype stage. Although rumor has it the original machine still works to this day.
Well, when you ride a motorcycle, or when you anything, you have wind. That's right. You have ventilation in the hood. If you're in an open car, then you have wind against the top, but not on the bottom. If you're on a motorcycle, you have wind against the whole body. All these things in the machine.
How about the smell? Or what kind of smell?
Smell is all kinds of smells.
All kinds of smell?
Yeah. The machine can take 10 smells.
10 smells?
Yeah, so I generally have about 2 smells for each film. But you can have more. I have 10 smells, but you can have 50 smells. There's no, when it's fed in, you get it here. There's wind against your body, you smell. Of course, stereophonic sound, 3D, peripheral vision, big picture. This machine could do twice as big, but I didn't do that because of the limitation of the film size and the resolution. That's about it, but this was 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And now today, there still is nothing as complete as this.
Another key moment was the release of the head-side helmet by the company Philco in 1961. This invention brought us one step closer to modern VR headsets. It was actually the first real head-mounted display, or HMD, a bit like a motorcycle helmet with a screen built into it. While not yet true virtual reality, this helmet was connected to a remote camera that displayed the real physical world. There wasn't anything virtual about it, just our normal, everyday reality. For example, such a system allowed an operator to safely observe dangerous places remotely. An important innovation here was magnetic tracking technology, which monitored the user's head movements. So when the operator turned their head, the camera would move accordingly, allowing them to look around remotely. In 1968, another groundbreaking device appeared, a helmet called the Sword of Damocles, officially named Stereoscopic Television Apparatus for Individual Use. Clearly, Sword of Damocles was a more memorable name. It was created by Ivan Sutherland and was attached to a massive mechanical structure hanging from the ceiling directly above the user's head, which explains its dramatic name. Honestly, it looked pretty scary. It was needed to track the user's position. The helmet allowed users to see simple geometric shapes, like cubes, projected onto transparent screens. These shapes were overlaid on the real environment around the user, making it arguably the first augmented reality device. The tracking system meant these shapes were not static. They moved as the user moved. The system also relied on a powerful computer to perform all necessary calculations. Now let's move closer to the present day. In 1984, the American computer scientists Jaron Lanier founded VPL Research, a company dedicated to developing and selling virtual reality products. By the way, Jaron is often credited with popularizing the term virtual reality. VPL Research developed several products that already looked quite similar to modern VR gear, including a hand-mounted display, a sensor-equipped suit called the Data Suit, and a glove called the Data Glove. The glove tracked hand movements, transmitting data to the computer, and allowing interaction with virtual objects. They also developed a system named Reality Built for Two, which let two people share the same virtual space. VPL Research was one of the first companies to sell VR kits not just for scientific or military purposes, but commercially. These devices were incredibly expensive. The glove alone cost around $10,000, and the full set with a suit and helmet cost around $100,000. So clearly not for mass market use.
Well, this is our virtual reality glove. It's called the Data Glove. And the idea is that you can put on this glove, and the glove lets you feel a world that doesn't exist as if it's real and pick up things in the world as if they're real. So it lets you reach into an imaginary world. And these are the special glasses called the iPhones that you put on. And when you put them on, you're seeing inside an imaginary world instead of inside the physical world.
Around the same period, similar research was happening at NASA. For instance, NASA developed the Virtual Visual Environment Display System, which included a head-mounted display, HMD, a gesture control glove, surround sound, and voice control, all back in the mid-80s. NASA continued experimenting with various VR systems and used them, for example, to train astronauts.
The Virtual Environment Display System is a multisensory interactive display environment in which a user can virtually explore a 360-degree synthesized or remotely sensed environment and can viscerally interact with its components. The objective of this research is to develop a multi-purpose operator interface environment with initial applications in telerobotics, data management, and human factors research.
Another product worth mentioning from this era is the Virtuality System, introduced in 1990. At the Computer Graphics Expo. These were arcade machines designed specifically for virtual reality games. They had two versions called pods, one version where the player stood up, and another designed like a car for sitting down. Both came with special helmets featuring built-in displays, joysticks, and network connectivity, allowing players to enjoy multiplayer experiences. Obviously, these were too large and expensive for home use, so you could only find them in gaming arcades. But just as traditional arcade games slowly transitioned into living rooms through home consoles, VR systems in the 90s also began taking their first steps in that direction. As you might remember from earlier episodes, there was serious competition among home console manufacturers at that time. Companies were always interested in new technologies that could attract more customers and show everyone that their console was the most advanced. It all started with something called the Active Shutter 3D system. With the system, the user wore special glasses, though these were lighter and less bulky than the ones used in typical VR setups today. The way it worked was quite interesting. The glasses would rapidly alternate, quickly blocking one eye at a time, so that at any given time only one eye sees the picture. Meanwhile, the TV or monitor displayed two slightly shifted images in quick succession, just like a stereoscope. The glasses and the screen were synchronized, so each eye only saw the image intended for it. Because these shifts happened extremely fast, our brains easily combined the two images, creating a convincing illusion of depth and three-dimensionality. Yeah, there really are so many ways to trick our brains into seeing things that aren't actually there. The first such mechanism appeared at Nintendo in 1987 for their Famicom console and was called Famicom 3D System. Only 7 games were ever made for it. That same year, Sega released a similar system for their console called the Sega Scope 3D, which supported 8 games. These were mostly racing games, where the 3D effect added a greater feeling of speed. It was interesting but nothing groundbreaking, so overall the sales were low. 6 years later, in 1993, Sega made a big announcement. At several exhibitions, they were demonstrated a prototype VR headset, intended for their very popular Genesis console. But this headset's release was first delayed and eventually cancelled due to production issues and complaints from users about headaches caused by the screens. Around that same time, Nintendo also started experimenting with VR technology, initiating a new project codenamed VR32. They licensed a special red monochrome display technology which allowed them to produce a relatively affordable headset. You might remember from our first episode that during this period Nintendo was busy developing the next generation Nintendo 64 console and was also experiencing tensions with Sony. This led to delays while Sony successfully launched their new PlayStation console. Nintendo decided to speed up their experimental VR project so that the freed up resources were sooner directed to the development of the Nintendo 64. The resulting device, called Virtual Boy, was released in 1995, but unfortunately it was rushed and unfinished, becoming a major disappointment. Yes, compared to the active shutter glasses, Virtual Boy did offer a much stronger sense of three-dimensionality, but it had numerous problems right from the start. First, there was the strange design itself. The headset wasn't something you wore. Instead, it came with legs and stood on the table. Imagine trying to keep your head still in the same position for hours because the headset didn't move. It stayed fixed on the table. Your neck would quickly become tired, making gaming sessions uncomfortable. And to be honest, the whole setup looked pretty strange too. Another unusual thing was the red monochrome display. Yes, every single game appeared entirely in various shades of red. 50 shades of red, you might say. There was also no head or hand tracking, instead it came with an awkward controller. Players reported headaches, nausea, and eye strain. Plus, the 3D effect didn't truly enhance gameplay in a meaningful way, so it wasn't clear why anyone would buy this system. Ultimately, it became a commercial failure, and Nintendo stopped selling it after just 6 months. Another player in the console market, Atari, also announced a VR headset for their Jaguar console in 1995. It was developed in partnership with the same Virtuality group we discussed earlier, the makers of those arcade VR machines. But Atari's VR headset was never completed, and almost all existing prototypes were destroyed. Today, only 2 prototypes still exist. It wasn't looking great for VR at this point. Clearly, the industry wasn't ready yet. The technology was still immature, and companies didn't really understand what to do with VR experiences. Because of this, interest in virtual reality faded for a while. When even industry giants struggled to succeed, it seemed clear that VR's time had not yet come. Of course, there were still a few attempts and smaller projects, but nothing groundbreaking emerged for quite some time. Some time passed, and VR headsets moved from being futuristic dreams to collecting dust in garages. Somewhere between an old chair, a broken vacuum cleaner, and a forgotten fishing rod. But as often happens, the next big breakthrough came directly from one of those garages. From a young age, Palmer Luckey had always been fascinated by electronics and technology. He was constantly experimenting and building new things at home. When he was just 16, back in 2009, he became very interested in virtual reality. At that time, Palmer was already working several part-time jobs, fixing old iPhones, coaching sailing, and maintaining grounds. He says he earned around $36,000 doing these jobs and used this money to start buying second-hand virtual reality devices, hoping to find something useful. By that point, many older headsets had become surprisingly cheap. Palmer recalls once buying a VR device that originally cost $97,000 for only $80. He browsed eBay, government auctions, and industrial equipment websites, eventually building a large collection of devices. But soon he realized none of them were really good enough. Instead, he began taking these devices apart, modifying them, and eventually started building his own headset.
My name is Paul Merlucky, and I'm a virtual reality enthusiast and the designer of the Rift. Games are something I'm really passionate about, and even more than playing games, I'm passionate about bringing games to the next level. What we're doing at Oculus is trying to create the world's best virtual reality headset designed very specifically for gaming. Where this all started was in my parents' garage in Long Beach, California, and I was interested in stereoscopic displays, I was interested in head mounts, and the problem was there was nothing that gave me the experience that I wanted, the Matrix, where I can plug in and actually be in the game. And I was sure that somewhere out there was something that I could buy, and the reality is there's nothing. I set out to change that with the Oculus Rift. The magic that sets the Rift apart is immersive stereoscopic 3D rendering, a massive field of view, and ultra-low latency head tracking.
Palmer shared his progress online, posting regularly on the meant-to-be-seen forum. At that point, he had no plans to turn his hobby into a business. But through this forum, Palmer caught the attention of John Carmack, who we've already mentioned a few times this season. John is well known for revolutionizing video games, with classics like Doom and Quake at id Software. Interested in Palmer's designs, John asked him for a prototype and even showed it off at the E3 Expo in 2012, demonstrating Doom 3 in 3D mode. Suddenly, Palmer's VR headset gained massive attention. He dropped out of university to fully dedicate himself to his project. John Carmack later joined Palmer's company and became its technical director until 2019. Palmer then founded a company called Oculus VR and started a crowdfunding campaign on a Kickstarter. They hoped to raise $250,000 to create the first developer kit. Amazingly, they reached this goal in just 4 hours. Yes, $250,000 in only 4 hours. Almost 10,000 people supported the campaign, eventually raising nearly $2.5 million. Oculus Rift, as the headset would soon be named, became extremely popular overnight. In the spring of 2013, developers received the first Oculus Rift developer kits. These kits allowed game developers to start integrating VR into their games before the commercial release. Around this time, Mark Zuckerberg became interested in Oculus VR and, in early 2014, purchased the company for a massive $2 billion. You have to have a lot of faith in VR technology to buy a company for that kind of money, especially before it had even released a single consumer product. Not everyone was happy about this move. Many people were disappointed because they had supported a small, ambitious, independent startup, only for it to suddenly become part of a huge corporation. Plus, your $15 Kickstarter donation felt pretty small compared to Zuckerberg's $2 billion. However, joining Facebook meant Oculus no longer had to worry about raising money. They continued experimenting, creating prototypes, and improving their headsets. By mid-2014, the second developer kit was already released. But Oculus wasn't the only one paying attention to virtual reality at that time. Valve had also been experimenting with VR since around 2012. Initially, they had no plans to release their own headset. Their goal was just to push PC VR forward, because Valve strongly benefits from PC gaming growth. Online, you can find pictures of Valve's various early prototypes. For example, one of their first VR systems required covering your entire room with QR code-like markers, which the headset's camera would use to track movement. Imagine needing to stick these markers all over your room every time you wanted to play. Why is tracking so important anyway? First, it helps your character accurately reflect your own movements in the virtual world, whether you are crunching, jumping, or just looking around. But more importantly, good tracking significantly reduces dizziness and motion sickness, a major problem that plagued earlier VR models. When our brain notices any mismatch between our physical movements and what it sees, it doesn't feel good. Valve had reportedly solved these issues more effectively than Oculus at that time. The Wired article even describes the story of how Oculus VR CEO Brandon Eri flew to Valve's office to try out their prototype. It was exactly the kind of model that required the entire room to be covered in special icons. Brandon had a very poor tolerance for VR and got motion sickness pretty quickly. But the engineers at Valve claim that their new prototype didn't cause bad feelings. Brandon ended up watching the demo completely in this headset, and then immediately watched it again. He spent 45 minutes in virtual reality and didn't feel any discomfort. However, the partnership between Valve and Oculus didn't last. Valve eventually teamed up with HTC, and in April 2016, they launched their joint headset, the HTC Vive. Interestingly, the first consumer version of Oculus Rift was also released a week apart. HTC Vive featured special base stations placed at the edges of the gaming area, emitting invisible infrared signals and laser patterns. The headset and controllers use these signals to determine their position and movements very accurately. Oculus Rift, on the other hand, initially had just one tracking camera. It was making HTC Vive better suited for room-scale VR experiences, while Oculus Rift was more comfortable for seated games. HTC Vive also had specially designed VR controllers, whereas Oculus Rift initially shipped with an Xbox controller. And just like that, the competition between Oculus and HTC had begun. What else was going on in the market at this point? Meanwhile, Sony also jumped back into VR. Though Sony had experimented with VR back in the 90s without much success, by 2010 they began a new project called Project Morpheus, which initially felt like a side project created out of personal curiosity. Similar to Palmer Luckey's early experiments, Sony engineers were building homemade VR systems from existing parts. The headset was announced in 2014 and released in fall 2016 under the name PlayStation VR. The headset required a PlayStation 4. While technically less powerful than PC-based headsets, it was affordable, comfortable, and became very popular due to the widespread success of the PlayStation 4. Over 5 million units was sold, making it the best-selling VR headset for quite a while. Back to PC headsets. In March 2017, Palmer Luckey decided to leave Oculus and Facebook to do other business. Oculus continued releasing new models, introducing standalone headsets such as Oculus Go in 2017, which no longer required a PC. This became their main direction with the Oculus Quest line. Tracking technology also improved, moving from external base stations to cameras built directly into the headset. Eye tracking technology appeared, allowing the headset to render areas you look at in high quality, while areas outside your field of view were rendered at lower quality, an elegant solution to save resources. In 2020, the pandemic hit. Everyone was stuck at home, attending endless Zoom meetings, and VR saw a sudden boom. You couldn't leave your home physically, but at least you could explore virtual worlds. This future seemed so inevitable that Facebook renamed itself Meta in late 2021, positioning VR and the creation of a metaverse as one of its top priorities.
I believe the metaverse is the next chapter for the internet. And it's the next chapter for our company too. So I've been thinking a lot about what this means for our company and who we are as we embark on this journey. And as part of this, it is time for us to adopt a new company brand to encompass everything that we do. To reflect who we are and what we hope to build, I am proud to announce that starting today, our company is now Meta. From now on, we're going to be Metaverse first, not Facebook first.
But when the pandemic ended, VR's popularity also began to fade. Recently, both HTC and Meta released new headsets, the HTC Vive Focus Vision for around $1,000 and the Meta Quest 3S for just $300. HTC realized it was difficult to compete directly with Meta, which could afford to sell products at a loss to build a market. As a result, HTC began focusing more on corporate and professional customers, while Meta aimed to make VR as accessible and common as smartphones. Not so long ago, they announced that they would license their Horizon OS to other VR headset manufacturers. Valve eventually created their own headset, the Valve Index, alongside their critically acclaimed VR game Half-Life Alyx. Even today, many consider Valve Index the best headset, and Half-Life Alyx the best VR game ever made. We talked about all of this in detail in a separate episode about Valve. Sony also launched a new headset version for the PlayStation 5 in early 2023. All the features of the headset have improved significantly and modern technology is used. But the lack of compatibility with the previous generation and the high price seems to have made the headset not very popular. A total of 2 million units were produced, and it is not clear how many of them were actually sold. After that, Sony suspended production and reduced the development of games for the headset. Another interesting thing is that today there are various suits and gloves that simulate different physical sensations, such as touching, heat, cold, and help you immerse yourself in virtual reality. But they are still too expensive. And that brings us to VR today. Technological hurdles are largely solved, and even a $300 headset is quite capable. The biggest challenge now is content. Sure, there are plenty of VR games, but not enough to make VR a must-have yet. Games like Half-Life Alyx showed how powerful good VR experience can be, and many bought headsets specifically for it. There are rumors Valve is working on a new headset, and perhaps even another major VR game. But with Valve, there are always lots of rumors. Besides full-sized headsets, there were also a few interesting technologies closely related to VR. Let's briefly check one of them out. At some point, someone had a clever idea. Everyone already carries a powerful smartphone with built-in sensors right in their pocket. So, why not use these phones as VR headsets instead of creating entirely new devices? Eventually, at the Google I/O conference in 2014, Google introduced Google Cardboard, a simple VR headset made literally out of cardboard, a pair of optical lenses, and a few clasps. You just insert your phone into this cardboard frame, and suddenly you had a working VR headset for only about $10. Later on, this concept evolved, replacing cardboard with stronger materials and sometimes even adding electronics for extra functionality. However, smartphone-based VR never really took off. Phones would heat up quickly, batteries drained fast, and technical limitations meant there were not any truly impressive games. As a result, interest faded fairly quickly. There is another technology developing alongside VR, augmented reality. As we discussed earlier, AR started way back with the Sword of Damocles device. Augmented reality differs from virtual reality because you are not fully immersed in a virtual environment. Instead, you see our real physical world with digital objects overlaid onto it. This technology also has quite a long history. One memorable moment was back in 2014, when Google introduced their Google Glass, glasses that amazed many people at that time. In the demo videos, the interface looked straight out of a Tony Stark suit from the Marvel comics. The glasses were essentially frames without traditional lenses, featuring a small prism above the right eye that displayed information. They also included a built-in camera and touchpad. It all looked incredibly futuristic. Users could control them through voice commands or simple gestures. But in practice, the glasses didn't do very much, and they were quite expensive, $1,500. Eventually, the project was closed. Augmented reality has also been tested extensively on smartphones. Imagine pointing your phone's camera at an empty space and suddenly digital objects appear on the screen. This concept gained huge popularity with the 2016 release of Pokémon Go, a game where players hunted for Pokémon creatures throughout cities all over the world. Microsoft also stepped into the augmented reality market with their HoloLens glasses. And they even introduced the Windows Mixed Reality platform, allowing other manufacturers to create their own headsets. However, HoloLens was eventually discontinued and the platform was phased out from Windows. In 2024, Apple released their Vision Pro headset. Before its release, some commentators were confident. Even though other companies had failed, Apple would surely create something easy, appealing, and mass market. Something everyone would want to use. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out that way. Despite being technologically advanced, Vision Pro ended up too expensive, uncomfortable, and lacked practical everyday applications. People would buy it, use it for a short time, then set it aside and forget about it. So far, augmented reality hasn't had the breakthrough many hoped for. Large AR headsets are still too bulky and uncomfortable, while smaller glasses struggle to offer powerful features and high quality. Recently, Meta showed journalists a prototype of their Meta Orion glasses, and early impressions were definitely positive. They are generally compact, normal-looking glasses, but they are still just prototypes. Meta doesn't expect to release a commercial version for at least 2 years. So development in augmented reality continues, but what exactly will come of it remains to be seen. So, that is the story and the current state of virtual and augmented reality. Although a few years ago we were promised a revolution, with predictions that we would soon be living in virtual worlds, it hasn't really happened yet. Still, these technologies have come a very long way. There have been major breakthroughs, but also periods when everyone lost faith. Today, VR feels like a relatively mature technology, something that is impressive but no longer surprising. The main challenge, in my view, is still the lack of truly engaging content. Perhaps as affordable headsets become more widespread, more exciting experiences will appear. Augmented reality still faces many technical hurdles, and it is still not totally clear whether this technology is really needed in everyday life. It will be very interesting to see how VR and AR develop over the next 5 or 10 years. Let's talk about that in season 7 of the podcast, shall we? In the meantime, thank you very much for listening. This was the released podcast, and I'll see you next time.